In this presentation, I will be talking about a cultural centre which has asked to remain anonymous. From this point on, I'll be referring to it as My Local Cultural Centre, or MLCC. This presentation outlines the practices and policies of my local cultural centre in terms of barriers and enablers to participation and inclusion of people with disability. Barriers and enablers, including physical, attitudinal, contextual, and historical, are reviewed and critically analysed. Organisations that minimise barriers enabling participation and inclusion of people with disabilities give individuals a sense of belonging. This presentation shows that although my local cultural centre has barriers to participation and inclusion, it is on the way to creating a community where people with disabilities feel they belong. My name is Joanna Neale. I live with my husband and 2 children. My eldest is very creative and loves studying and art making. My youngest is very inquisitive and loves learning. He is also autistic, has severe generalized anxiety and sensory processing disorder. We visit my local cultural centre often. It suits our family, though it doesn't always work out for my son, who has had both positive and negative experiences. Earlier this year, my daughter had a painting displayed in an exhibition. We went to the opening night, however, it was a disaster for my son. I have chosen this organisation as I would like to see it improve in the area of disability, access and inclusion. I would love for my son to have great experiences every time. MLCC is run by the local council. The cultural centre consists of a cafe, gift shop, a permanent gallery and an art gallery. There is also a large foyer featuring lounges with an outdoor space and a viewing platform. The exhibitions in the art gallery predominantly feature local artists. The foyer and outdoor space are used for a variety of events. The Vision and Mission 2020 statement of the Cultural Centre states it is acknowledged nationally and internationally as the preeminent arts and cultural institution of the region. In researching MLCC, I read the policy documents that the Council hold which apply to MLCC. These include a Disability and Inclusion Action Plan and an easy-read version of this, Anti-Discrimination and Harassment Policy, Volunteers Policy and their annual report. I interviewed a council employee whom I will call Jan, connected to the Cultural Centre, and a contracted teacher who runs one of their workshops. I studied MLCC's social media presence, Facebook, Instagram and Twitter, and viewed the local newspaper, including archived stories. I then considered anecdotal evidence from my own experiences, followed by those of friends and family. In collating the information for my research, a number of physical, contextual and attitudinal enablers became evident, including a functioning lift with braille and voiceover, clear railing and ramps on the viewing platform, bathroom with an adult change table and lift, and art featuring people with disabilities, as well as many others, as well as some attitudinal enablers, including friendly, knowledgeable and welcoming staff and the previously mentioned Easy Read Disability Inclusion Action Plan. Additionally, as a result of COVID-19 restrictions, there are now many online videos that are captioned. Through reviewing and analysing the Council's MLCC, a number of attitudinal and historical barriers became evident. The Council's Aged and Disability Services Officer, Jan, indicated she is dissatisfied with how accessible and inclusive the Cultural Centre is to people with disabilities. She felt that a lot more change was needed. Jan has brought her own personal and work history to her role, which has influenced change and reduced many physical barriers for people with disabilities. However, the limitations in her role has meant that she has had little room to focus on any barriers other than physical ones. Jan commented on the tug-of-war between balancing resources for accessible facilities with the Council's budget for other needs. There is a perception that barriers for inclusion for people with disabilities was not their problem, but the state or federal government. This shows a clear barrier that the Cultural Centre has in the attitude and value they place on inclusion of people with disabilities. Craig and Bigby concluded that inclusion for people with disabilities would increase with education and awareness. Jan commented on her ongoing attempts to educate council staff on what inclusion means. What you think is inclusive is not necessarily what a person with a disability believes it is. Jan has had to fight for employees' training in disability awareness and inclusion, which as a result is now in the DIAP, stating, undertake disability awareness, human rights and inclusion training for all staff, executive and councillors. However, Jan was unsure if it is compulsory nor if many staff had completed it. In considering my own history with MLCC, I look at the opening night I attended in January of this year. There were significant barriers for my son and parents to stay at the event that led to them leaving early. It was crowded and loud. There were no calm or quiet areas and a lack of seating. My son became very agitated, loud, and somewhat aggressive. He became very overwhelmed and anxious. My aged parents felt overwhelmed with the crowd's heat, noise, and lack of seats. SPD Australia states that sensory processing disorder affects 1 in 20 children in Australia. As Sullivan and Kearney discuss a universal design specifically considering sensory processing disorder. Through their research using virtual reality goggles, O'Sullivan and Kearney demonstrate that the creation of awareness amongst employees is key to developing and sustaining an environment that is accessible and inclusive. Barriers have the potential to be avoided if staff are provided with disability awareness training. In my discussions regarding MLCC with members of the community, I know a number of common themes arose. Access was complicated with poor signage and a lack of information about where to park, especially for users of mobility aids, many unaware there was convenient parking, though the low roof meant it was not suitable for all. Events were described as crowded, loud and overwhelming with no quiet spaces. Many wanted more detail before attending events, like the order of the program, photos and social stories. Workshops needed to go at a slower pace. More seating was needed at events. Audio productions on exhibitions needed to be captioned, and heavy doors. Jan commented that electronic doors have now been installed after a person in a wheelchair broke their leg trying to open the previous doors. The Access Advisory Committee has been campaigning for these to be replaced for some time. The New South Wales Disability Inclusion Act of 2014 requires New South Wales councils to have a Disability Inclusion Action Plan. The Council's Disability and Inclusion Action Plan states that the Access Advisory Committee identified a set of 6 directives to guide our actions for inclusion. These directives from the AAC were overlapped with the 4 focus areas of the New South Wales Government's Disability Inclusion Plan to create the current Disability and Inclusion Action Plan. These focus areas have been broken down into many strategies. Progress on the strategies is reported in the Council's annual report. Einstein's ladder of citizen participation would suggest the Council is at a tokenism level, where the community is informed by the DIAP of how the Council will become more inclusive of people with disabilities, and where the Council consults with the AAC on strategies to achieve this. The Council's DIAP explains how they are working towards minimal barriers for people with disabilities. However, the true extent of barriers suggests this is an illusion and merely a token attempt to maintain the status quo. Duffy and Perez refer to citizens as being free and living life within a community the way they want to, that a community is where life is. Milner and Kelly suggest community is where you belong. MLCC has created a creative arts community where people both local and from afar come together to celebrate local artists and their work. They have created spaces for friendships to form, such as the cafe, regular art markets, opening art events, local artist talks and workshops. However, is this community inclusive to all, regardless of if a person is living with a disability? Do visitors to the Cultural Centre feel like citizens? MLCC runs a 6-week program called Inspired by Art, 4 times a year, that is advertised as all-inclusive. This is some of the art that has been produced in this program. Participants come from a local disability service as well as the wider community, with a wide range of disabilities and ages. The Council's lack of understanding of being inclusive meant they wanted the class to exclusively be for people with disabilities, and it took 4 years for the Council to agree to include people without disabilities. As stated in a local newspaper by a manager of a disability service that supports adults attending the program, The classes aim not to just teach art, but to break down barriers that always keep disabled people separate. This picture is of the opening art exhibition that they had. The teacher stated that the art produced has only once been showcased publicly, though it was not in the main gallery, but rather located in an out-of-the-way room. And as you can see, it's quite a small room as well. The Inspired by Art program is creating a community with a sense of belonging reflected in the number of participants that repeatedly attend each year and participants staying for lunch together in the cafe after the workshop sessions. During the 2020 COVID-19 restrictions, the teacher has been approached many times with, "When is art starting back?" A father of one of the participants gave feedback after another participant saw his son in a public setting and chatted to him, saying, "That was so beautiful." These examples show that participants in the program are treated equally as citizens, in line with Duffy and Perez's concept of citizenship. However, this is only one program the Cultural Centre hosts. The contracted teacher did not believe that other programs offered have people with disabilities attending. Even with the Council's attitudes towards disabilities being focused on physical barriers as seen in their diet, and in conversation with Jan, it is only the Inspired by Art program that has enabled people with disabilities to achieve a sense of belonging and being part of a community. Milner and Kelly suggest that there are 5 key attributes of place that give participants a sense of belonging: self-determination, social identity, reciprocity and valued contribution, participatory expectations, and psychological safety. MLCC is a public facility open to all members of the community. However, not all programs are accessible to people with disabilities, thus reducing their choice to participate and options of self-determination. Milner and Kelly say that people gravitate towards relationships and places where they feel known. The Cultural Centre is giving people social identity through having welcoming and permanent staff who become familiar to all who visit, evidence that relationships continue outside of the Inspired by Art program, use of the cafe by people with disabilities, and community events that are welcome to all people, though not maybe inclusive to all people with disabilities. There have been people with disabilities featured in a number of publicly displayed artworks at MLCC. The focus of the art is not on the individual's disability, but rather on their abilities. Milner and Kelly comment that disability art broadens understanding by inviting mainstream culture to see itself through others' eyes. Art is a valued contribution to mainstream community. However, art that has been produced by people with disabilities in the Inspired by Art program is rarely showcased, suggesting their contribution to community is not valued. The participatory expectations of people with disabilities at MLCC are limited, as seen in how people with disabilities are not included in programs offered other than Inspired by Art. Jan spoke of the Council's Access Advisory Committee that includes members of the community who represent a variety of different disabilities. The committee is viewed as a strong voice in the decision process that affects the running of the Cultural Centre. Not only are they engaged in decisions about future plans, but also are strong advocates for changes needed to make the Cultural Centre an inclusive facility and community with minimal barriers for people with disabilities, giving them psychological safety. My local Cultural Centre is a welcoming and interesting place to visit. It has many physical attributes that enable people with disabilities to access its services and facilities. Whilst there is evidence of change and strong advocates for more, the barriers for people with disabilities are largely around education and consequently attitudes of council employees and the community. Looking at the council's diap, it conveys a general move towards a social model of disability, as laid out in the United Nations 2006 Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, showing consideration for societal barriers experienced by people with disabilities. However, the actual experiences of these people reveal a lack of knowledge of the variety of disabilities, focusing on the more obvious and physical aspects of their disability. This subsequently minimizes the ability of people with disabilities to be included and for them to sense they belong. Shakespeare observed, "It is often easier to fit a ramp or provide screen reader software than to change the prejudices which are so often associated with disability. As the renewal of the DIAP approaches, there is much hope that it will reflect a move towards a cultural centre that is a place that people with disabilities can feel they belong. Thank you for listening.